A retired German shepherd stood motionless in a tranquil sunlit yard, his body trembling as he ignored the ball tossed by his grieving master. He was supposed to know only peace his duty forever done, but just 30 feet away, hidden behind a single fence, 2 little boys lay silent in a dark abyss entombed beneath a locked shed. They were starving, abandoned, and utterly forgotten. They had been left to perish. No one else could hear their silent prayers. No one else knew they were there. But this dog, he smelled their terror. He smelled the approaching decay. He recognized the scent of pure evil. What happened next will make you question which is more powerful, human cruelty or a dog's unwavering loyalty. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. And if you believe that our animal guardians are sent to find those who are truly lost, hit that subscribe button, because this story, it's one that might just restore your faith in real heroes. The flawless blue sky above Portland, Oregon was a lie. It spoke of a profound peace stretching clear and wide over the silent suburban streets, offering up a perfect fragile 19 degrees Celsius that felt more like the dawn of spring than the slow surrender of autumn. It was the kind of weather that was supposed to mend a broken spirit. For Officer Cale Riley, it felt like a mockery. He stood on his back porch, the orbital sander humming in his grip, its vibration a hollow substitute for the life that used to fill his hands. The smell of fresh pine sawdust did little to mask the lingering scent of hospital antiseptic that haunted his memory. He stood 6'2", built like a tactical necessity. But the last 3 months had sandpapered him down to his very soul. His eyes, the color of the Willamette River on an overcast day, were hollow with exhaustion. He was on mandatory leave, a department-issued prescription for grief. 3 months since the silt-gray sedan tore through the light. 3 months since his wife Ara had taken her last rattling breath, her hand in his. Ara, who was all brilliant laughter and vibrant chaos, had been the living color in his monochrome world. Now the silence of the house was an oppressive weight, broken only by the sanding and the deep rhythmic breathing of his only remaining partner. That partner was Havoc. Havoc was 90 pounds of pure black and tan discipline, a retired German Shepherd K9 who carried his 7 years with the solemn dignity of a veteran. His muzzle was just beginning to be dusted with gray, and a pale, thin scar sliced along his left flank, a souvenir from a warehouse raid Cale wished he could forget. Havoc was, by every definition of the word, a professional. Even in retirement, he would never jump on the furniture, never beg for food, and he only barked when protocol required it. But Havoc had his quirks too, as Ara had lovingly called it. Cale called it psychic. The dog possessed an eerie, almost unsettling intuition. He'd once refused to enter a building Cale was about to clear. Cale waited, and the meth lab inside exploded from a pressure cooker failure just 2 minutes later. Cale trusted Havoc's instincts more than he did most human intelligence. On this day, however, Havoc's iron discipline was beginning to fracture, and his psychic energy was humming. He was supposed to be sunbathing on the warm deck, a hard-earned perk of civilian life. Instead, he was restless, and that restlessness had begun an hour ago. Havoc had abandoned his favorite marrowbone, the very one Cale bought him that morning, leaving it untouched on the mat. Then came the pacing, the relentless click-click-click of his heavy claws on the deck boards. A sound Cale usually found so comforting had become a restless pendulum. Havoc paced from the sliding glass door to the edge of the porch, then pivoted his movements sharp, precise, a patrol route, worn deep into the wood. He wasn't just walking, he was scanning. His entire focus was fixed on the property line, specifically on the tall, unkept privacy fence that divided Kyle's tidy yard from the neighbors. The neighbors were new. Kyle had only seen them twice. They had moved in a month ago, a quiet couple named Marcus and Jezebel. Kyle had offered his usual tight-lipped wave of greeting. Marcus, a large man who seemed to want to shrink into himself, had just nodded, avoiding his gaze. But Jezebel? She was the one who unnerved Kyle. He'd seen her once retrieving the mail. She was tall, thin, perhaps too thin, with a cascade of unnaturally black hair. Her face was like sharp porcelain. She had smiled at Kyle, a bright, flashing smile that never reached her cold, pale blue eyes. It was a performance, and Kyle knew performances all too well. After that, they were ghosts. No barbecue smoke, no sounds of settling, and just an unnerving silence. Havoc, however, wasn't interested in their house. His entire being was locked onto that fence. "Settle, Hav," Kyle murmured, without shutting off the sander. The command was pure muscle memory, instinctive. Havoc paused his pacing for a single second, his ear swiveling back to acknowledge the sound before immediately resuming his vigilant patrol. This was new. Havoc never ignored a command, no matter how subtle. Kyle clicked off the sander, the sudden silence amplifying the click, click, click of the dog's claws on the wood. "Hey," Kyle said, his voice deepening. "What is it, boy, a squirrel?" But Havoc ignored him, stalking straight to the fence line. His black nose pressed against a gap in the slats, sampling the air with short, powerful huffs. He let out a low, frustrated whine, a sound of deep, primal agitation. He retreated his paws, tracing the fence line once more, before returning to that single, crucial gap. This was no mere squirrel. This was no stray cat. This was something that had shattered Havoc's retirement and put him right back on duty. Kyle wiped a bead of sweat and sawdust from his forehead. He was tired, he was grieving. The last thing he wanted was a problem. He just wanted to sand his porch until his arms went numb, and his mind finally went quiet. "Havoc here." Kyle's voice was sharp now. It was the voice of a handler, not a pet owner. The dog froze, torn between two unshakable loyalties. His ingrained obedience and the urgent primal instinct screaming at his senses. Kyle softened his tone. "Come on, boy, leave it. Let's play." He bent down, picking up the bright yellow tennis ball, still slick with slobber, from an earlier, more normal game. "You want the ball? Go get the ball." He faked a throw. Havoc's head twitched, but his gaze remained locked on the fence. Kyle sighed, straightened up, and put his full strength behind it, hurling the ball across the yard toward the far corner. "Fetch!" The ball hit the grass, bounced once, and rolled to a stop. Havoc didn't move. He never even looked at the ball. He didn't so much as blink. He just stood there, a 90-pound statue of coiled tension. Kyle felt the first cold prickle of adrenaline, that familiar sensation he'd lived with for 15 long years, the one he was supposed to be learning how to live without. Havoc. He took a step toward the dog. Havoc took a matching step toward the fence. His gaze was no longer on the fence itself, but on whatever lay beyond it. His head was low, his ears pinned forward, his powerful body perfectly unnervingly still. His stare was fixed with a terrifying intensity on the neighbor's property. Kyle's eyes followed his. From this vantage point, he could see into their backyard. It was just as unkempt as the front lawn. Weeds were strangling the grass, but tucked away in the far back corner, half hidden by a tangle of overgrown blackberry bushes, stood a dilapidated wooden shed. Its paint was flaking away, and one of its windows was boarded shut. To Kyle, it was just an old shed, but Havoc saw something more. The hair along his spine from the nape of his neck to the base of his tail stood up in a stiff, unwavering ridge. A low rumble, a vibration more felt than heard, began deep within his chest. He took 2 slow, calculated steps forward until his nose nearly brushed the weathered wood of the fence. He was utterly silent. Kyle recognized this behavior instantly. This was the calm before the storm. This was the silence when a suspect was concealed beneath a bed, holding their breath, praying not to be found. It was the moment just before all hell broke loose. "Havoc, leave it," Kyle commanded, but his voice held no real authority. He knew it was already too late. Havoc's body trembled, his powerful muscles coiling like a spring, and then he released it. It was not a bark. A bark was for a squirrel, the mailman, or a passing dog. This was a sound Kyle hadn't heard since Havoc was officially retired from the force. It was a single, sharp, professional woof. It was an alert. It was the sound that meant a find. It was the bark that communicated, "I have located illegal substances," or "I have located a person." Kyle Riley's blood ran cold. The bright, warm 19-degree day dissolved, replaced by the chilling, stark reality of his partner's signal. The sandpaper slipped from his numb fingers, clattering loudly against the wooden deck. That single sharp woof silenced the world. The drone of the orbital sander, the distant hum of Portland traffic, the memory of Ara's laugh. It all disappeared, swallowed by the void created by that one professional sound. In that instant, Kyle Riley was no longer a grieving husband on leave. He was a handler, and his partner had just signaled a find. He moved off the porch in one seamless, fluid motion, his boots making hardly a sound on the steps. He left the sandpaper lying on the deck, a forgotten relic of a life that had vanished just 60 seconds ago. He strode to the fence, his eyes methodically scanning the neighbor's property. The rundown shed in the corner was no longer an eyesore. It was now a target. Havoc stood trembling with anticipation by the fence, his nose pressed into a gap in the boards, but he made no further sound. He had made his report. Now he was waiting for his handler to take action. Kyle's mind raced. He was off duty unarmed and dressed in civilian clothes, a worn t-shirt stained with sawdust and sorrow. He had no probable cause. He had nothing but the unwavering instinct of a dog that any court of law would dismiss. But Kyle had watched Havoc find a missing child in a 300-acre forest. He had seen him alert on a single gram of a potent substance hidden deep inside a steel-belted tire. Kyle trusted his partner. He would bet his own life on that dog. He would bet Ara's life on him too, if only he still could. He unlatched his side gate, stepped out onto the sidewalk, and walked the 30 feet to his neighbor's front door. The house was a mirror image of his own. But where Kyle's was slowly being healed, this one felt utterly abandoned. The paint was chipping away, and the flower beds were suffocated by dandelions. He pressed the doorbell. He could hear a faint chime, a distant, cheerful sound from within. There was no answer. He knocked 3 sharp raps. Asterisk, police, asterisk. The thought echoed in his head, but he kept the word silent. He was for all appearances just a neighbor. He waited. Then he heard movement, the distinct click of a deadbolt sliding back. The door opened just a crack. The door swung wide, revealing her. Jezebel standing in the frame just as he'd pictured, yet somehow infinitely more unnerving. Standing a full 6 feet tall, her thinness was startling, a collection of sharp angles barely held together by a sheath of pale skin. Her jet-black hair, almost unnaturally so, was wrenched back into a severe, tight bun. A bright yellow floral apron was stretched over a plain black t-shirt. The contrast was jarring, a vulture cloaked in carnival attire. That apron was nothing more than a costume, a fragile, desperate attempt at normalcy. But her eyes, those cold, pale blue eyes, were all business cutting through the facade. Her gaze swept over Kyle, a head-to-toe assessment. "Yes," she chirped. The voice was a bright, tinkling sound, a chilling mismatch to the emptiness in her eyes. The smile she offered was enormous, and full of teeth, a predator's warning thinly veiled as a welcome. "Can I help you?" "Hi," Kyle said, his voice measured and calm, the one he always used to de-escalate. "I'm Kyle Riley. Your neighbor?" He hooked a thumb back toward his own house. "Sorry to bother you, ma'am, but I'm an officer with the PPB." He watched her smile flicker just for a second. The corners of her mouth tightened. "Ma'am, my dog. I'm his K9 handler. He's become extremely agitated by something in your backyard. His focus is on that shed in the corner." He deliberately kept his tone light, inquisitive, entirely non-threatening. Jezebel's smile snapped back into place wider than before, followed by a small, manufactured laugh. "Oh my goodness, an officer! I am so terribly sorry. I assure you it's absolutely nothing sinister." She leaned in conspiratorially, and Kyle was struck by a thick wave of her perfume, a heavy, cloying gardenia. "It must be the rats," she whispered, her face contorting into a mask of disgust. "This old property is just overrun with them. Absolutely vile things. My husband Marcus set out some traps just before he left for his business trip. I'm certain that's what your talented dog is smelling. Just some nasty dead vermin. It was the perfect explanation. Plausible, simple, and it shut him down completely. It accounted for a potential bad odor and the husband's absence. But every instinct in Kyle's gut screamed, liar! A canine trained for human remains, and narcotics doesn't signal on a dead rat. I see, Kyle said, holding his ground. When did your husband leave? The question was a test, and her smile never wavered. Just this morning, for a software conference up in Seattle. He'll be gone the entire week. She was good, but Kyle saw it, the tiny pulse hammering in her throat, a frantic bird trapped just beneath her porcelain skin. Look at me being such a terrible hostess, Jezebel chirped, her tone suddenly gushing as she gripped the doorframe. It is so warm for October, isn't it? I just made a fresh pitcher of lemonade. Please, you must come in and have a glass. It's the very least I can do for our neighborhood's finest. She swung the door open wider, a blatant invitation to be led astray. Kyle's eyes moved past her into the house. It was dark. Despite the brilliant 19-degree sunlight, every single blind was drawn shut. Every curtain was pulled. It was a cave. No thank you, ma'am, Kyle said, feeling the cold, sharp sting of frustration. He was beaten. He had no probable cause, only a dead end. He would have to retreat, request a welfare check, and by the time uniforms arrived, whatever was in that shed could be long gone. He despised this feeling. I'll do my best to keep my dog quiet. You have a good day now. He turned away, the bitter taste of defeat coating his tongue like metal. The crushing weight of failure settled upon him, a bitter echo of not reaching the hospital to say goodbye to Ara. He took a single defeated step back toward his home. And in that very instant, Havoc, having exhausted the last shred of his trained patience, Havoc took the mission into his own paws. From Kyle's yard, a sharp crack of splintering wood echoed, followed by a harsh scrape. Kyle whipped around as Jezebel's head snapped toward the sound, her eyes flying wide with dawning horror. Kyle had never known about the rotted board at the base of his fence, tucked away behind an overgrown rosemary bush. But Havoc had known. He had clawed it, widened the gap, and now he was through. He exploded from the foliage onto Jezebel's lawn like a 90-pound black and tan missile. He made no sound, his focus absolute. Every movement economical, his paws digging into the patchy grass as he sprinted. He was a weapon locked on a single unwavering target, the shed. The change in Jezebel was instantaneous. The warm facade of the smiling, apron-wearing neighbor didn't just slip, it completely shattered. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, undiluted rage and terror. "No!" she shrieked, her voice plunging from a melodic chime to a harsh, gravelly roar. "You damn dog, get out of my yard! Get out!" She lunged from her porch, stumbling as she raced to intercept Havoc, but she was far too slow. Havoc was faster, smarter, and driven by a powerful purpose. Kyle didn't hesitate. The woman's raw panic was his probable cause. Her fear wasn't about her weeds. It was about that dog reaching her shed. In that instant, all his training, all his crushing grief, and all his instincts fused into one single imperative move. He was past the gate in a flash. "Ma'am, stay back!" he commanded, his voice now the deep, booming bark of a police officer taking control. He didn't run. He moved in a controlled, tactical advance. His eyes were fixed on the shed, his mind cataloging. One partner Havoc, one civilian Jezebel now screaming obscenities, and one unknown. He followed his partner toward the unmistakable scent of a crime. Havoc was a black and tan streak of lightning, a guided missile of instinct streaking straight for the target. Kyle was seconds behind, his long legs devouring the neglected yard, his mind a cold, clear space. All the grief, the heavy fog of his leave of absence was incinerated by the pure, clean adrenaline of the hunt. Jezebel was still screaming, her voice a shrill siren cutting the perfect 19-degree air. "I'm calling the cops. That's assault. Your dog is on my property. I'll have him put down. I'll sue you for everything." Kyle didn't hear the words, only the desperate frequency. It was the unmistakable sound of a cornered animal, a high-pitched vibration of profound guilt. He reached the shed a half-second after Havoc. The dog, trained to identify points of entry, had already swept the perimeter. He was waiting at the front door as Kyle arrived. It was a solid, heavy planked door, utterly out of place on the dilapidated structure. It was secured not by a simple garden latch, but by a thick, laminated steel padlock, the kind used for industrial storage. This was a lock designed for containment, not just to keep people out. The smell hit him then. It wasn't the faint whiff he'd caught from his porch. Here it was a physical entity. It clung to the rotting wood, a foul miasma of must-damp earth, and the sharp, eye-watering ammonia of decay. But something else was woven deep within it, something thick and rancid that Kyle's training instantly recognized. It was the smell of long-term human squalor. It was the sour, acidic tang of unwashed bodies, stale sweat, and old, cold filth. It was the smell of a place where things were kept hidden, a place that was never meant to be opened. Jezebel grabbed his arm from behind. Her bony fingers sank into his bicep like claws. "Get off my land," she hissed. "This is your only warning. I'm calling 911 this instant." Kel didn't spare her a glance. His entire focus was consumed by the lock as he executed a simple Tongoim practiced wrist peel, one he'd used 1,000 times before shattering her grip with cold precision. "Ma'am," he stated, his voice flat, deep, and absolute. "You need to step back. Now." The instantaneous switch from concerned neighbor to unyielding officer stunned her into silence. Her fury was swallowed by the sheer force of his command. She staggered backward, hands trembling as she fumbled for her phone, her fingers stabbing frantically at the screen. "You're out of your mind. They'll strip you of your badge for this." But Havoc had already vanished. He'd completely ignored the fortified door. It was a diversion. His brilliant canine mind had processed the scene and pinpointed the true source. He was at the shed's far corner, a place almost entirely obscured from the house by a tangle of blackberry thorns and a chaotic heap of trash. It was a stack of 4 threadbare tires topped with a musty, folded blue tarp. Havoc was digging, but not the playful digging of a pet. This was a frenzied, desperate excavation, a dog with a mission. His powerful forelegs were a blur of motion, launching chunks of damp earth and stone that pelted the side of the shed. He stopped for a moment to let out a high-strained whine, a desperate sound. It was the call of a partner in need of backup. "Havoc, show me." Kyle's voice was a raw command. He was already in motion, grabbing the top tire as his muscles screamed in protest. It was heavy, burdened with black, stagnant rainwater that sloshed over his shirt as he violently tossed it aside. Then the second and the third. He kicked the final one out of his way. Beneath it all lay the blue tarp, rigid with mildew and crisscrossed with slug trails. He tore it away. It wasn't earth beneath, it was a lid. A 3-by-3-foot section of the foundation crudely hacked from pressure-treated plywood. It was a makeshift patch, a hidden door. Someone had covered it with loose dirt and gravel, a desperate attempt at camouflage. But it was undeniably a hatch. Havoc was now on the wood itself, his claws skittering uselessly across the slick, damp surface. The vile stench was 10 times stronger here, leaking from the edges of the wood like a toxic vapor. The dog ceased his frantic scratching and looked up at Kyle. His intelligent brown eyes filled with a terror Kyle had never witnessed before. "You have hands!" the look screamed in silent desperation. "Open it!" And then Kyle saw the blood. Havoc had clawed at the sharp gravel and splintered wood with such single-minded focus that he'd shredded the pads of his paws. He was leaving crimson prints on the hatch. "Enough, Hav?" Kyle commanded, his voice firm. "Back?" The dog, gasping for breath, blood dripping from his paws to the dirt, instantly obeyed. He retreated 2 paces, his entire frame trembling with anticipation, a coiled spring awaiting the next order. "He's crazy. He's bleeding all over my property." Jezebel shrieked into her phone. Yes, send someone immediately. An officer is attacking me. He's destroying everything. Kyle heard the faint wail of approaching sirens. She hadn't been bluffing. She had actually called them on him. He had only seconds. Dropping to his knees, he jammed his fingers into the tight gap between the plywood and the shed's cinder block foundation. He pulled with all his might. It wouldn't move, latched or nailed shut from within. Damn it! He quickly shifted his weight, bracing his boot against the cinder block wall. He drove his fingers deeper into the crack, ignoring the sharp pain of splintering wood. There was no crowbar, no tool to help. He had only the fire of adrenaline and the unwavering certainty of his partner, and with it a sudden white-hot rage at what this unholy smell implied. His mind flashed to Ara, to the crushing silence in his own home. He channeled every ounce of his grief, every pound of his 20-pound frame into one singular explosive pull. A sound of splintering, tortured wood cried out. A sharp crack echoed as the nails holding it shut ripped free from their hold. The heavy hatch flew open, landing with a sickening thud on the grass. The impact was instantaneous. This wasn't just a smell. It was a physical assault, a pressurized, suffocating wave of heat, ammonia, and decay blasted out of the hole, hitting Kyle in the face like a solid blow. It was the concentrated, weaponized stench of absolute despair. Kyle reeled back, his hand clamping over his mouth as his stomach violently revolted. He gagged, coughing, his eyes watering so fiercely he was momentarily blind. The crisp, 19-degree Portland air was a forgotten dream, replaced by this toxic fog. He heard Havoc let out a strangled, choked bark. He heard Jezebel, her screaming silenced, let out a single horrified gasp. He wiped his eyes, his vision slowly clearing, and stared down into the black, reeking hole. The stench of ammonia and human suffering felt alive, clawing its way from the darkness, desperate to fill Kyle's lungs. He dropped to his knees, gagging, fighting the primal urge to be sick. He could hear the approaching sirens, the very ones she had called on him, growing louder just a block away. Then, a car door slammed, followed by a sharp, authoritative voice. "Ma'am, Portland Police, what's the problem here?" Jezebel was frozen, a statue of pure terror, her face a waxy white mask. Her phone was silent in her hand. She couldn't form a word. Cale wiped hot tears of revulsion from his face. And then his training took over. A cold steel wall slammed down, caging his rage. He had to see. He fumbled for his cell phone, his thumb swiping frantically, bypassing the call screen to stab at the flashlight icon. He flicked it on. The LED's beam was pathetic, a weak spear against the absolute darkness. But it was enough. He aimed it down into the hole. His mind, conditioned by years of tactical scenarios, expected a cellar, a room, maybe a ladder. This was none of those things. This was a grave. It was a shallow, earthen pit, dug maybe 4 feet deep with walls of cold, damp, packed dirt. There was no blanket, no pillow, not even a bottle of water, just a pile of filthy, sodden rags in the far corner. And then the light found them. The rags moved. Cale's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't one shape, it was two. Two small, skeletal figures huddled together against the cold 19-degree air, now flooding their tomb. They were 7-year-old twin boys, Leo and Milo, though you could never have guessed their age from their ravaged frames. They were like creatures from a famine, their skin a pale gray canvas stretched taut over the sharp knobs of their bones. It was the single most harrowing sight of Cale's career, a scene of pure, unadulterated evil. Milo, the younger twin by mere minutes, lay on the bottom. He lay on his side, his tiny body curled into a fragile ball. He was utterly, terrifyingly still. He was a heartbreaking collection of limbs, a constellation of dark, ugly bruises mapping his skin, some old, and yellowed others fresh and purple. His breathing was so shallow, Cale couldn't see the rise and fall of his chest. He looked like a casualty of war, a body waiting to be catalogued. This was why Havoc had been so frantic. The dog had smelled death. or something terrifyingly close to it. And then there was Leo. Leo was the guardian. He was just as thin, just as bruised, but his eyes were open. He was a shield of skin and bone draped over his brother's form. As Cale's flashlight beam swept across him, there was no scream, no cry. He simply stared his eyes, two bottomless voids where childhood had been extinguished, replaced by a deep, defiant terror that felt ancient. The grime of the pit was caked onto his skin, the same filth he was forced to lie in. This hole was their bathroom, and the stench wasn't just in the air, it had become a part of them. Then the wail of the sirens died, plunging the scene into an absolute quiet, broken only by the crunch of his partner's boots on the gravel in the yard. "Portland Police." "Anyone back here?" a voice called, but Cale's gaze was locked on the pit. He fought to make his own voice gentle. "It's okay," he whispered the words catching in his throat. "I'm a police officer. I'm here to help." But they felt like a cruel lie. Where had he been? Where had anyone been? The boy Leo flinched at the soft sound, pressing himself even tighter against his brother, as if to absorb the threat. His gaze wasn't on Cale. It was fixed past him on the dark silhouette of Jezebel, framed by the stark halo of Cale's flashlight. Leo's chapped lips parted, and a sound like dry leaves scraping across pavement rasped from his throat. "Please." The whisper escaped him. Cale leaned in. What is it, son?" But Leo's terrified eyes were locked on Jezebel. The plea was for her. She said it was a game. His voice fractured into a dry sob. "A quiet game. And we lost. We were too loud." He struggled to pull a tattered rag more securely over Milo's shoulder. "Please, don't hit Milo. He's sick. He can't be quiet anymore. Just hit me." In that instant, a white-hot, blinding rage detonated behind Cale's eyes, a fury so purely murderous, so absolute it nearly drove him to his knees. In that moment, the badge, the uniform, it all vanished. He was no longer a cop. He was just a widower, with nothing left to lose, ready to end the woman standing a mere 5 feet from him. He felt a tingling in his hands, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. He understood with terrifying clarity what true evil looked like, and the justice it demanded. He stood frozen, balanced on the razor's edge of his own humanity. Then the stalemate was broken. Havoc, who had been panting, his bloody paws planted at the edge, took a decisive step. There was no order, no command. He simply acted. He slid more than leaped down into the pit, his paws landing softly on the damp earth. A terrified gasp tore from Leo's throat as he scrambled to shield his brother, bracing for another attack. A 90-pound animal had just entered their grave. But Havoc didn't bark. He didn't snarl. Instead, he lowered his head, guided by an incredible, knowing intuition. He gently nudged past Leo's bony shoulder, and with his long, warm tongue, he began to lick Milo's cold, still face. Once, then twice. That single act of impossible tenderness accomplished what all the cruelty had not. It broke Leo. The boy's rigid protective wall just dissolved. A sound Cale had never heard before. A dry, tearing sob that seemed to claw its way up from the center of the earth was ripped from the boy's chest. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He lunged forward, wrapping his thin, skeletal arms around the dog's powerful neck. He buried his matted, filthy head into Havoc's thick fur and just clung there, shaking silently as if the dog was the only solid thing left in the universe. Cale rose to his feet. The rage hadn't vanished, but it was no longer in command. Now it was fuel. He turned away from the hole and saw his two partners. Officers Chen and Bellamy frozen at the corner of the shed. Their guns were drawn, their faces pale and etched with shock as they processed the scene. Cale, the blood-soaked dog, the weeping woman, and the unholy stench that hung in the air. Cale pulled out his phone, but he didn't dial 911. He opened his radio app and keyed the mic. His voice was no mere whisper. It was a blade of cold, hard professional command that sliced through the serene Oregon air. "This is Officer Riley, off duty at 845 West Ridge. I have a code 3. I'm looking at 2 juvenile victims of torture. I need an ambulance. A child crimes detective and a forensics unit immediately. The suspect is on the scene and is not to be approached." "She is mine." He ended the call, the click echoing in the silence. His gaze found Jezebel. She was staring at the hole, transfixed by the sight of the boy clinging to the dog. Her face was a mask of utter cosmic disbelief. The sirens wailing in the distance. They had been for her all along. In the quiet yard, Kyle's radio call was a thunderclap. Officers Chen and Bellamy, who had been approaching Kyle as a potential suspect themselves, instantly snapped into action. Their weapons were reholstered in a single fluid motion as their minds raced to recalibrate the entire scene. This was no officer having a breakdown. This was a rescue. Officer Chen, a woman whose small 5'3" frame held the unbending will of a drill sergeant, was the first to move. Young with a sharp, intelligent face, she was a woman who tolerated no chaos. "Jezebel!" she yelled, her voice a whip crack of a command. "Get on your knees, hands behind your back now." Jezebel, who had been staring, dumbfounded at the hole, let out a panicked shriek as Chen and Bellamy descended upon her. "No, get off me. It was discipline. They're liars, such wicked boys. You have no proof. My husband will sue you. This is my private property." Her voice was a finely tuned symphony of practiced victimhood. Bellamy, a 20-year veteran with a heavy-set build and eyes that had seen everything Portland had to offer, simply grunted as he secured the cuffs. "Save it, ma'am." Kyle couldn't watch. He was already back at the edge of the pit. "Ambulance is 2 minutes out," he yelled over his shoulder. His eyes fell on Havoc, who was still whining, his bloody paws right at the edge. "Havoc out, Rouse." The German Shepherd scrambled back, immediately obeying the command. Kyle dropped into this hole. The stench was a physical weight, a palpable evil that seemed to coat his skin and fill his lungs. He landed in 6 inches of cold human waste. He didn't care. His attention went to Milo, first the smaller stiller of the 2 brothers. He pressed 2 fingers to the boy's neck, a pulse faint thready, but there, he was alive. "He's breathing," Kyle yelled, relief shattering his voice. 2 paramedics, one an older man, Mike, with a face like worn leather, and a younger woman, Sarah, with wide, horrified eyes, were already at the edge of the pit with a gurney and a backboard. "Hand him up," Mike commanded, his voice all business. Kyle slid his arms under Milo's tiny skeletal body. The boy weighed almost nothing less than a sack of dog food. He felt as fragile as a bundle of dry twigs. Kyle carefully handed him up into Sarah's waiting arms. She let out an involuntary gasp as she took the weight, her professionalism at war, with her revulsion. He turned to Leo. The boy was pressed against the dirt wall, his huge, terrified eyes watching Kyle's every move. He was shaking violently. "It's okay, Leo. It's your turn. We're going home." Kyle's voice was softer than he knew he was capable of. He held out his arms. Leo didn't move. He just stared, vibrating with sheer terror. "It's okay," Kyle said again, his voice low and steady. He reached out slowly. "I'm not her. I'm Kyle." He gently scooped the boy into his arms. Leo let out a small, terrified whimper and went completely rigid, but he was simply too weak to fight. Kyle lifted him out of that dark hole and placed him on the gurney next to his brother. As soon as his feet were on the gurney, Leo scrambled over the bedding, clutching at Havoc's fur, as the dog rested his head on the gurney's edge, holding firm, his knuckles bone white. The paramedics didn't question it. They just ran. A man in a rumpled suit stepped into Cale's path, blocking his way. It was Detective Miles, a man Cale had worked with for over a decade. Miles was a coffee and cigarettes cop, perpetually worn down, but he was the best detective from homicide to child crimes on the force. "Riley, my God, you're on leave!" His eyes shot to the hole, then to Jezebel, screaming as she was forced into a patrol car. "The dog alerted," Cale said, his voice flat and low. He was covered in filth. I knocked. She lied. Claimed it was rats. Said her husband was gone. The dog got through the fence. She panicked. I found the hatch. Miles nodded, taking it all in. Go, he said, clapping Cale's shoulder. Ride with them. You're the witness, and they're going to need you. We'll process the scene here. Cale followed the gurney, refusing to be separated from the boys for a single second. He and Havoc climbed into the back of the ambulance. Havoc sat on the floor, his body pressed to the gurney. A silent, blood-stained guardian. The ride was a blur of shrill beeps and the calm, controlled voices of the determined paramedics. Milo was fading. His pressure was dropping. Get the pediatric Lucas device ready, Mike said urgently. Leo, can you tell me your name? Sarah asked, her voice impossibly gentle. Leo just stared, his small hands still tangled deeply in Havoc's thick fur. The harsh lights of the OSU hospital emergency bay were a shock. They were rushed immediately into a trauma room. A woman with dark, curly hair in a tight bun and a gaze that could cut steel met them. What do we have? She demanded. This was Dr. Aris. 2 7-year-old males found in a pit. Severe malnutrition, hypothermia, unknown trauma, Mike reported. Doctor, Aris's eyes took in the boys, Cale, and the dog in a single glance. She didn't hesitate. Get me warmers, bloods, a full X-ray trauma series, and get security on this door now. An hour later, Cale was sitting in the hallway, a solitary figure. The stench of that place still clung to him. A nurse had given him scrubs, but he hadn't changed. He was still a key witness. Dr. Aris found him. Officer Riley. Her voice was hard. It's bad. I've been an ER doctor for 20 years. This is top 3. Milo is septic. His core temp was 94.2. He's severely dehydrated. We're pushing fluids and broad-spectrum antibiotics. But his condition is critical. He may not make it. Cale's stomach clenched hard. And Leo, Dr. Aris crossed her arms. Leo is far more stable, but his body is a roadmap of past abuse. He has multiple healed fractures. His left radius 2 ribs. These are old, officer. Months old, maybe years. And the new contusions, they're patterned. Dice. They match a belt buckle and something cylindrical. A broom handle, maybe a dowel rod. Based on their dehydration and electrolyte levels, what? I'd say they were in that hole without food or water for at least 4 days. Maybe longer. Cale simply nodded. 4 days. The same amount of time Marcus was supposedly in Seattle. He was allowed in to see them in a quiet pediatric room, cleaned and hooked to a dozen machines. Milo was unconscious, a tiny, pale figure, almost swallowed by white blankets. Leo was awake. He was in the bed by the window where a nurse was trying to help him. Come on, sweetie. The nurse, a kind grandmotherly woman named Patty, was saying softly, Let's just get this dirty hospital gown off and put on a clean one. As she reached for him, Leo let out a high-pitched, piercing shriek. A raw, terrified cry ripped from him, less human than the scream of a trapped animal, as he scrambled to the bed's far corner, pulling his knees to his chin. His eyes were wild with a primal fear. Beside him, Milo's monitor screamed a frantic rhythm as his heart raced. It's all right. I am not going to hurt you. Patty pleaded, her hands raised in surrender. Cale moved between them. Patty, can you give us a moment? Please just leave the gown. With a face etched in pity, Patty nodded and slipped silently from the room. Cale walked closer, giving a quiet signal to Havoc. The dog, who had been cleaned by a vet, padded to the bedside and rested his great chin on the mattress. The tremors racking Leo's small frame eased, if only for an instant. Cale sank to the floor, deliberately putting himself below the boy's line of sight. Leo, it's me. It's Cale. You're safe now. She's not here. Leo's gaze darted from Cale to Havoc, then back to the door, his whole body humming with fear. Why were you so afraid? Son, she's a nurse just trying to help you. Leo inched forward, his terrified eyes still locked on the doorway. He leaned in, his voice a broken, rasping whisper so faint Cale had to strain to hear. She said if we made noise, if we told anyone, she'd She'd do it again? An icy dread flooded Cale's veins. Do what again, Leo? The boy's face dissolved in anguish, fighting back tears from a quiet game that had been brutally burned into him. Buster, he breathed. She took care of Buster. Cale's brow furrowed. Who is Buster? At the name, Leo's fragile control shattered. A single agonizing tear traced a path down his hollow cheek. Our puppy, from before. He barked. He just barked at her, and she put him away in a black bag. She said we were next. That she would make us disappear just like the dog. If we ever made a sound. Cale squeezed his eyes shut. This was not just 4 days of neglect. This was a methodical, long-term campaign of absolute terror. He rested his hand on the bed. In a sudden, desperate motion, Leo scrambled from the bed to the floor, burrowing himself into the safe space between Cale and Havoc, finally releasing the soul-crushing sobs he had imprisoned for years. The hospital air was a sterile lie, smelling of bleach and weak coffee, a pathetic attempt to mask the metallic taste of blood and the acrid stench of sickness. For 6 hours, Cale had kept his vigil in the pediatric ward hallway. He refused to leave. He had given his statement to Detective Miles 3 times, each word feeling blunt and useless, a hollow summary of the evil that festered in that pit. He was still in the filthy, stinking scrubs the nurse had given him. He couldn't make himself change. It would have felt like a betrayal. To be clean would mean accepting it was over. It wasn't. He listened to the rhythmic, agonizing beep coming from Milo's room, the sound of a heart monitor fighting a battle. It was losing. Across the hall, Leo was sedated, finally finding a fragile peace after his terror-fueled collapse. Cale had become their self-appointed guard, sitting in a hard plastic chair with Havoc lying like a shadow at his feet. The dog hadn't moved, a 90-pound statue of black and tan loyalty. His stained paws were a stark reminder on the polished linoleum. Just after 3 in the morning, the elevator chimed. Cale looked up. Detective Miles stepped out, his face a mask of utter exhaustion. He was not alone. He was escorting a large man who seemed to be physically collapsing into himself. This was Marcus, a man built of soft, undefined parts. His expensive business suit was hopelessly crushed. His face was pale and puffy. He looked like a man who'd never been told no and was now facing a truth he couldn't buy, bribe, or delegate away. He was not a monster like Jezebel. He was worse. He was a void. He had caught the first flight back from Seattle. He claims he didn't know. Miles stated, his voice flat. Then Marcus saw Cale and froze his eyes wide with utter confusion. Who are you? Where are my sons? She told me. She said they were at her mother's. Mr. Marcus, Cale began, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He rose to his full 6'2" height, an imposing, intimidating figure, still covered in the earth from the hole where his sons were found. Your wife lied. Cale pointed to the ICU door. Your son, Milo, is in there. He's septic. His fever is 104 degrees and his kidneys are failing. He may not survive the night. Then Cale pointed toward the other door. Your other son Leo is in there. He has 2 healed rib fractures and a healed break in his left arm. He's been disciplined with a belt and a rod. He told me he was sorry for being too loud. Marcus's legs gave out. He didn't just kneel. He crumbled, slumping against the wall as a deep animal wail ripped from his chest. It was the sound of a man's entire world ending. I didn't know, he sobbed, his large, soft hands clawing at his hair. She said they were a handful, that I was too soft on them. She told me they needed discipline. He looked at Detective Miles, his eyes pleading. I travel so much. I let her handle it. I didn't know. Cale felt nothing. No pity, no anger, just a cold, empty distance. She threatened to do to them what she did to their puppy, Cale said, his voice like a blade. Did you know about that too? Marcus's head snapped up his face, a mask of uncomprehending horror. No, Buster. She said he ran away. In that moment, the man's soul, however weak, shattered. He understood. He was complicit. Miles pulled him to his feet. "You're under investigation for criminal neglect, Mr. Marcus. You have the right to an attorney." As his world ended, the world for his sons began. They were no longer his. They were wards of the state of Oregon, and they had nowhere else to go. The next 3 weeks were a chaotic blur. Milo, in a show of pure, stubborn will, did not die. He stabilized. But the trauma and the sepsis had stolen something precious. He had woken up, but he hadn't spoken. He was mute, a silent, hollow-eyed ghost of a boy. Leo, too, was silent, but his was a silence of watchful terror. Once they were medically cleared, they were moved from the hospital to the St. Jude's Children's Shelter, a secure CPS facility downtown. Cale's mandatory leave was no longer about his wife's death. His grief, that all-consuming black hole, had not vanished. It had merely shifted. It had found a new, terrible purpose. He was obsessed. He thought only of Ara. He thought of the long, quiet nights they'd spent on their porch, planning a future. He remembered the conversation, the one that had been just words then, but was a screaming command now. "Cale," she had said 6 months before the accident. "We have so much. We have this big house. We have us. We should share it. We should adopt. There are kids who need us." He had been too busy. He had said, "Maybe next year, Ara. The timing isn't right." The timing was now. Every day at 3 in the afternoon, Cale would arrive at St. Jude S, and every single day Havoc was with him. At first, the staff was wary. A large off-duty cop and his even larger scarred German shepherd were not their usual visitors, but they saw what Havoc did. The boys were in a shared room, small and sterile. Leo would sit in the corner hoarding the crackers he was given. Milo would just stare at the wall, motionless, refusing to eat. But when Havoc entered the room, a flicker of something changed. The dog, sensing the profound brokenness that hung in the air, would walk straight to Milo's bed, rest his heavy head on the thin mattress, and let out a deep, knowing sigh. And Leo, seeing Havoc, would slowly, cautiously emerge from his corner to sit on the floor, his small hand tentatively reaching out to just brush the tip of Havoc's tail. For an hour each day, Kyle would sit in a chair, a silent witness, while his dog conducted the only therapy that seemed to break through, the only therapy that mattered. On the 22nd day, a woman was waiting for Kyle in the lobby. She was in her late 50s with intelligent, weary eyes and dark hair pulled back into a severe bun. She wore a simple gray blazer and slacks, the unspoken uniform of someone who fought losing battles for a living. This was Mrs. Alvarez, the CPS district director. She was the embodiment of the system. "Officer Riley," she began, her voice professional, yet not entirely unkind. "We need to talk." They sat in her small, cluttered office. Havoc, a silent sentinel at Kyle's feet. "I need to be blunt," she stated, folding her hands on the desk. "The boy's father has relinquished his parental rights. He's facing years in prison. And Jez, she will never see the light of day again. Leo and Milo are now officially and permanently wards of the state." Kyle nodded, his voice firm. "I'll be a foster parent. I'll take them." "Mrs." Alvarez released a slow, weary sigh. "It's not that simple. You're a single man, a police officer working a high-risk job. And frankly, you're a recent widower. The system, it sees you as a liability." "I'm a hero to them," Kyle retorted, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "That doesn't matter," she countered gently. "What matters is the reality. And the reality is I have 2 7-year-old boys. A bonded pair who under no circumstances can be separated. They are both severely traumatized. Leo hoards food and suffers from extreme night terrors. Milo is completely non-verbal and will require years of specialized intensive therapy." She leaned forward, her voice dropping. "No one wants a package deal like that, officer. No one wants a traumatized child, let alone 2 of them. The waiting list for a healthy infant is 5 years long. The waiting list for these boys, It's 0. The blood drained from Kyle's face. So, what are you saying? I'm saying, she began, her voice softening with genuine regret, that my job is to find them a home, not the perfect home, and the only viable way to place them is to separate them. Leo, he has a chance. A family in Eugene might consider taking him, but Milo will likely be institutionalized. He'll be a lifer in the system. Kyle felt the room tilt on its axis. Separate them. The very word was a sacrilege. It was a betrayal of everything he fought for. He glanced through the small window in her office door, his eyes drawn down the hall to the common room. He saw Havoc, who had been given permission to wait with the boys. The dog was standing faithfully by Milo's chair. Milo, the boy who hadn't truly moved in 3 weeks, was listlessly holding a spoon, and Havoc, with that uncanny intuition of his, gently nudged the boy's hand with his wet nose. Then he softly licked the back of Milo's hand, and Milo's small fingers. They tightened on the spoon. Kyle stood up abruptly. Mrs. Alvarez stopped talking mid-sentence. Officer Riley. Kyle turned to face her, his eyes no longer clouded by grief, no longer hollow. They were ablaze with a fierce new purpose. No, he said, his voice low and dangerous. You will not separate them. He pointed a steady finger to his own chest. You said I'm a risk. You said I'm a single man. I don't care. They need a home, and I am their home. Mrs. Alvarez looked utterly stunned. Officer Riley, you don't understand what you're saying. The paperwork, the training, the certification, it can take months, even years. Then start the paperwork, Cale cut in, his voice ringing with a newfound finality. It was the voice of a man who had touched the abyss and was now climbing out. Start it today. I'm taking them both. My wife Aller and I, we were going to adopt. His gaze drifted to his loyal dog, whose head now rested gently in Milo's lap. I'm keeping her promise. I want them, and I will not let them be separated. End of discussion. Mrs. Alvarez, a woman of her word, saw the unbreakable vow in his eyes. She saw the steel in Cale's gaze, the unshakable weight of his promise, and she fought the system. She made it move with a speed Cale had never witnessed. The emergency foster certification for a police officer, a widower, the very man who saved them, was pushed through with unprecedented urgency. It was still a mountain of paperwork, of deeply personal home studies, and psychological evaluations that felt more like interrogations, but Cale attacked it all with the same relentless focus he once reserved for a cold case. He was a man on a mission fueled by Allar's memory. He officially returned to his duties at the Portland Police Bureau, but he was not the same man, not the same officer. He had traded his tactical vest and the adrenaline of the streets for a quiet desk, a mountain of case files, and a predictable 8-to-5 shift. His captain, a man who understood the language of grief, approved the transfer to the records division, no questions asked. The silence Cale once craved, the same silence that had echoed with Allar's ghost, was now shattered. His quiet, sterile home had become a battlefield of healing, and it was louder than any firefight he'd ever known. Leo and Milo moved in on a Tuesday with one small cardboard box of donated clothes and a file thick with trauma. That first night, Cale made them his one specialty, scrambled eggs and toast. Leo, his eyes darting around the pristine kitchen, devoured 3 full plates, eating so fast he nearly made himself sick. Milo just pushed the eggs around his plate, his gaze lost until Havoc gently nudged his hand with his nose. Milo then slowly, deliberately took a piece of toast and held it under the table for the dog. Cale's house, once a quiet shrine to his grief, had become a minefield of unseen terrors. A car backfiring sent Leo scrambling under the kitchen table in a flash. The click of the preheating oven, a sound too close to a padlock on a shed, sent Milo hiding in the shower where Cale found him, shaking uncontrollably. And then came the nights. The nights were the worst. The nightmares weren't just dreams. They were brutal, violent reenactments. Leo, the little guardian who had witnessed everything, would wake up screaming a raw, high-pitched, terrified sound that ripped Cale from his own troubled sleep. He'd rush in to find Leo thrashing in his bed, fighting invisible demons. But it was the hoarding that truly broke his heart. On the third day, as Cale was changing Leo's sheets, his hand brushed against something hard. Under the pillow, tucked deep into the mattress seam, were 3 saltine crackers, a half-eaten apple, and a single piece of dry toast, all carefully wrapped in a paper towel. The boy was still starving, even in a house filled with food. He was saving it, hiding it, bracing himself for a hunger that might never come again. Cale had to close the bedroom door, leaning against the wall, and just fight for his next breath. Milo, meanwhile, remained a silent shadow, a ghost moving through Cale's home without a single sound. But he wasn't detached, not really. His communication was quiet, tactile and desperate. When Cale sat doing paperwork, Milo would stand beside his chair until his small, cold hand would eventually creep into Cale's larger one, holding on for dear life. He would stand there for an hour, holding Kyle's hand, his grip a tiny, fragile vice. It was his only anchor. When Kyle watched TV, Milo would sit on this floor, his back pressed firmly to Havoc's side, his fingers tangled deep in the dog's thick fur. The breaking point came 2 weeks in. Kyle was exhausted, never sleeping more than 90 minutes at a time. He was failing. He knew it. He was a cop, a handler, a soldier, but he was not a father. He had just gotten Leo to sleep after a 2-hour nightmare. It was 3 a.m. He sat at the kitchen table, his head in his hands, when the screaming started again. But this was different. It wasn't the sound of terror. It was a sound of pure, primal agony. He ran. He burst into the boy's room. Leo was sitting bolt upright in his bed, his eyes wide open. But he wasn't seeing Kyle. He was seeing her. "I'm sorry," he shrieked, his voice cracking. "I'm sorry. We were quiet. I promise we were." And then he began to hit himself, balling his tiny skeletal fists to beat his own head, his temples, his face with all his might. "Bad!" he screamed. "Bad boy, bad, bad!" Kyle lunged, grabbing his wrists. "Leo, no! Stop, you're safe." But Leo was a wild animal, fighting with a strength Kyle couldn't believe, kicking, screaming, his small body rigid with self-loathing. "Let me go, I have to. I was bad. She said. Kyle tried to hold him, to pin his arms, but as he restrained one, the other broke free. He was hurting Kyle. But worse, he was hurting himself, his face already blooming with red welts. "Leo, please," Kyle begged, his voice breaking. He was losing. He, a 220-pound police officer, was being defeated by a 50-pound 7-year-old. He couldn't stop him. Havoc, who had been standing in the doorway whining in agitation, made his move. This was not a command. It was the pure instinct Kyle had learned to trust with his life. He sprang. Not at Kyle, not at Leo. He leaped onto the bed, inserting himself with tactical precision between them. He pushed his heavy body against Leo's chest, a 90-pound weighted blanket. As Leo's fists came up to strike his own face, Havoc moved his head. He took the blows, shoving his broad, scarred head under Leo's flailing arms, absorbing the frantic punches. Thump, thump, thump. The sound of fists on his thick skull. Havoc didn't flinch. He just pushed closer, his body a living shield, a barrier against the boy's own pain. He began to whine, a low, cooing, motherly sound, and licked the tears from Leo's face. The fight in Leo stopped. It just evaporated. The boy's rigid, screaming body went limp. He stared his eyes, finally seeing the dog taking his punishment. He collapsed. His hands, no longer fists, grabbed handfuls of Havoc's fur. The screams dissolved into a storm of deep, racking, agonizing sobs. He buried his face in the dog's neck, his whole body shaking, finally broken. Kyle, his own chest aching, sat on the edge of the bed, his hand on Leo's back, his other on Havoc's head. The room was silent, save for the sound of Leo's weeping. From the other side of the room, from the small bed in the corner, a tiny, rasping, unused voice cut through the darkness. Milo, a silent witness in the shadows, stared at his brother. He stared at the boy and the dog, his face pale in the moonlight. "Don't," he whispered. Cale's head shot up as the crying ceased. They both stared, transfixed. Milo's gaze was fixed on his brother, his eyes suddenly sharp and clear. "Don't," he said once more, his voice finding an impossible strength. "Don't hit." They were the first words he'd spoken since that dark place. The word hung in the 3 a.m. void, a fragile anchor in the darkness. That simple command was the most powerful sound Cale had ever heard. Leo, a final sob catching in his throat, slowly unfastened his arms from around Havoc's powerful neck. He just stared at his brother. Cale was frozen on the bed's edge, barely daring to breathe. Milo's small, pale face had become a mask of profound and fierce determination. He looked at Leo. "Don't hit," he breathed again, his voice a rusty, broken thing. Leo just stared back, his expression unreadable, his little chest heaving with emotion. And then for the first time since they were found, Leo gave a slight nod. He obeyed. The nightmare was shattered, not by Cale's power, but by a loyal dog's quiet courage and a brother's first reclaimed command. Cale gently gathered the shaking Leo to his chest as Havoc padded from the bed to Milo's, resting his great head on the small boy's lap. The two brothers simply gazed at each other across the shadowed room, forever linked by a shared past and now a shared future. 6 months on their world was a different place entirely. The quiet, cold courtroom of the Multnomah County Courthouse was standing room only. Cale sat in the front row, wearing a crisp, dark suit that felt far more suffocating than his tactical vest ever had. On his left was Leo, on his right Milo. Both boys wore identical tiny gray suits Cale had bought for this day. Their hair was neatly combed. They were still thin, still carrying the faint, pale scars of their history, but they were no longer wraiths. They were truly present. Havoc, granted a rare exception by the court, lay loyally at their feet, a silent 90-pound testament to the truth. In the dock sat Jezebel. Prison had not been kind. Her porcelain face was drawn and gaunt, sallow, her unnaturally black hair marked by 2 inches of greasy, mousy brown roots. She seemed to vibrate with a furious, silent rage. Across the room in the gallery sat Marcus. He was a hollowed-out shell who had pleaded guilty to multiple counts of felony criminal neglect. He was now awaiting his own sentence, having already agreed to the permanent termination of his parental rights. The new pivotal figure in their lives, the one who now held all the power, was Judge Alani Hassan. She was a woman in her late 60s, with kind, dark eyes set behind sharp, wire-rimmed glasses and a known reputation for zero tolerance for theatrics. She had examined every single photograph taken in that pit. She had read every single word of the medical reports. She looked at Jezebel, her face a mask of judicial neutrality. "Miss Jezebel Crowell," the judge's voice was sharp and cold. "You have been found guilty on 2 counts of attempted murder, and 2 counts of aggravated kidnapping, and multiple counts of felony assault. You still claim this was your idea of discipline." Jezebel lurched to her feet, her chains rattling. "They were monsters. They were liars. They deserved it all. They're the ones who drove me to it. It was their fault." The mask was completely gone, revealing the true, corrupted evil that lay beneath. Judge Hassan didn't flinch. "You are a vacuum of humanity, Miss Crowell. You took 2 innocent children and subjected them to a sustained campaign of terror that amounts to nothing less than depraved indifference. You are sentenced to the maximum allowed under the laws of the state of Oregon. 45 years to be served consecutively, not concurrently. You will never be eligible for parole." As officers led her away, Jezebel let out a single inhuman shriek, but no one in the room was listening. The judge's gaze then settled on Marcus. "Mr. Marcus, you have consented to the termination of your parental rights." Broken Marcus could only nod, tears streaming down his face. I failed them. I know I did. I'm so sorry. I agree to the termination." His gaze found Kyle. They deserve him." Judge Hassan's gavel struck the sound echoing through the sudden hush. "So ordered." One chapter closed, another was about to begin. Judge Hassan's eyes fell upon Kyle, Leo, and Milo, and the hardness in her face melted away. And now, she began, a small, genuine smile gracing her lips. We turn to the matter of the adoption of Leo and Milo Riley. Officer Kyle Riley, all necessary certifications are complete. You have served as their foster father for 6 months. You understand the permanence of this act, that they will be your sons legally and in every other conceivable way for all time. Kyle rose his hands, resting protectively on the boy's shoulders, his voice thick with emotion. Yes, Your Honor, I do. The judge then turned to Leo. Leo, do you want this man to be your father? Leo's eyes went from Kyle to the judge, and he nodded, his voice quiet but firm. Yes. Her gaze shifted. Milo, do you want this man to be your father? Milo, who had hardly uttered a sound for 6 months, looked up at Kyle. Then his eyes found Havoc. He gave a small nod. Yes. He breathed a whisper, meant only for his new family. Then it is with the utmost pleasure, Judge Hassan declared, her voice radiating warmth, that I hereby grant this adoption. Congratulations, Mr. Riley. And congratulations, sons. The gavel fell not as a sound, but as the final punctuation on their past. The next year was their story. That house in Portland, once a tomb of silence and sawdust, was now reborn. It was beautiful chaos. It was life ringing with the sound of slamming doors, the passionate debates over video games, and the constant comforting aroma of spaghetti. Kyle, Leo, and Milo were a family. 1 year to the day of the adoption. Leo, now 8 years old, and a healthy 20 pounds heavier, had found his voice. He was sarcastic, funny, and a fiercely protective big brother. The desperate need to hoard food was gone, replaced by good-natured complaints about Kyle's cooking. Therapy was helping. The nightmares still came, but their shadows were receding. He was in every way that mattered a perfectly normal, wonderfully obnoxious boy. And then there was Milo. Milo was the quiet miracle. The observer, the artist, his world still painted in softer shades. His shyness remained, his speech sometimes hesitant, but the silence was broken. He was talking. And for Kyle, peace arrived not in a wave, but in small, stolen moments of grace. One afternoon, while finishing shift paperwork in his home office, he heard Milo's voice from the living room. Kyle quietly peered around the corner. There was Milo on the floor, leaning his small back against Havoc's powerful side, a drawing in his lap. And he was talking, a quiet, conspiratorial stream of words meant only for Havoc. The teacher said my dragon drawing was the very best one, but I think I made his wings too green. Don't you tell Leo, he'll just say it's dumb. Havoc let out a soft sigh, his tail thumping a steady rhythm on the floor. The dog listened, a silent confidant. A smile touched Kyle's lips. His wife, Aura, was gone. That gaping wound of her loss would never fully heal. But the void was no longer empty. It was filled with the promise he made to her. It was brimming with life. Later that evening, Kyle sat on the back porch, the very one he'd been sanding what felt like a lifetime ago. The air was a perfect, warm 20 degrees Celsius. He held a cold beer, simply watching. The yard was no longer a wasteland of neglect. The grass was neatly cut. And in the center of it all stood Leo and Milo. Kyle had discovered a small online shop that crafted custom children's costumes. The boys were now wearing tiny, perfect replicas of the Portland Police Bureau uniform, right down to the hats. His boys, on patrol. "Suspects in the trees!" Leo cried out, pointing at a squirrel. "K9 Havoc, secure the perimeter." But Milo, the more serious one, said, "Havoc search." He pointed. But Havoc, the soulful retired hero who once felt the faintest tremors of suffering through a fence, simply looked at his boys. He let out a joyful, carefree bark. "He's not listening," Leo said, disappointed, snatching the yellow tennis ball, the very same one from that day. "Go get it, boy. Go get the bad guy," he urged, and threw the ball. And Havoc, no longer a restless weapon, but a guardian, an older brother, and the living, breathing heart of their family bounded after it with pure joy. Kyle leaned back in his chair, taking a sip of beer, watching his 3 sons play in the warm, setting sun. The true lesson in this story is that God's miracles are often profoundly quiet. A miracle is not always a blaring trumpet, but the stubborn, unexplainable instinct of a faithful dog. Sometimes it is a grieving man placed by a divine hand in the one exact spot to be the only one who could answer a prayer. Kyle was lost in his own pain, but God repurposed that agony into a saving grace. Havoc's restlessness was a divine calling, showing that God can use our brokenness to heal others, and in that sacred act heal ourselves. In our own lives, we all receive those same nudges. It's that sudden urge to check on a friend or the quiet voice inside that tells us to be brave. This story is a call for us to listen to that voice. If this story of redemption moved your heart, please help our community grow by sharing this video with someone who desperately needs hope. Kyle and Havoc were a single light in an overwhelming darkness. If you believe that God still sends protectors, both 2-legged and 4-legged, to save his children, please type Amen in the comments below. Comment Amen to declare your faith that good will always and forever triumph over evil. Please subscribe to our channel for more stories of unbreakable courage, and click the bell so you never miss a new message. May God bless and keep every single one of you,